The rain was falling softly against the glass walls of Alexander's penthouse, the kind of rain that felt personal, as if the sky itself was mourning. He stood in silence, holding a glass of untouched whiskey, staring at the city lights below. From this height, everything looked small: the people, the traffic, even the problems that once used to shake his world. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt small. Alexander Cole, a name that once commanded boardrooms, headlines, and the envy of other men. A billionaire before 40, a man whose charm could light up any room, whose smile could close any deal. He had a wife, Emily, elegant, educated, the perfect match in every photograph. Their love story was once painted as a fairy tale. Two golden people, standing side by side, destined to shine forever. But no one knew how quietly perfection can crack. The first signs of distance weren't loud. They were whispers, dinners canceled, conversations that ended in sighs, the warmth of touch replaced by the cold hum of luxury. Alexander was always chasing more: another company, another investment, another chance to prove he was worthy of everything he'd built. Emily, on the other hand, wanted something simpler, a life that felt real, not one wrapped in silk and staged smiles. "Alex," she had once said during one of their last dinners together, "do you ever feel lonely, even when everyone wants to be near you?" He had looked at her confused. "Lonely? Emily, we have everything." She smiled softly. "That's the problem." 5 years later, the photographs that once hung on his penthouse walls were gone. The mansion in Malibu, sold. The laughter that once echoed through his life, gone. Emily had left with grace. No scandal, no drama, just a quiet departure that left a louder silence than any argument could. He had signed the divorce papers with a steady hand, but his heart trembled with something he didn't recognize: regret. He dated others for a while: models, actresses, women who wanted the billionaire, not the man. And Alexander let them. It was easier that way. They didn't ask questions about his loneliness, or why his eyes sometimes looked like he was staring at ghosts. But inside, the emptiness kept growing, until he met her. It happened on a Sunday, a day he used to hate because it reminded him of what peace used to feel like. Alexander had driven out to a small neighborhood cafe on the edge of town. He wanted to escape. No suits, no board members, just silence. The cafe was small, warm, and smelled of cinnamon and coffee. There was soft jazz playing, and behind the counter was a young woman with deep, brown skin and the kind of smile that didn't belong to this world. It was too sincere, too real. "Good morning," she said, with a brightness that made him look up from his thoughts. "You look like you need something strong." "Coffee?" Days turned into weeks. He returned to that cafe again, and again, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to hear her talk. She was nothing like the people in his world. Zoe talked about life, not luxury. She worked 2 jobs, but still found time to volunteer at a youth center. She didn't care about money, power, or fame, and she cared about people. And slowly, she started to see through his walls. "You know," she said one afternoon, "you always sit in that same corner and stare out the window. What are you looking for?" He hesitated. "Something I lost." "Maybe someone." Zoe smiled gently. "Maybe you're not supposed to find them. Maybe you're supposed to find yourself first." It hit him harder than she could imagine. For years, Alexander had been running from failure, from pain, from the memory of Emily's disappointed eyes. But with Zoe, he didn't have to run. She made him feel seen, human, enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the cafe in gold, Alexander walked Zoe home. She lived in a modest apartment, nothing like the marble floors he was used to. But the warmth of her world made his seem cold by comparison. As they stood by her door, she turned to him. "You never talk much about your life," she said softly. He looked at her, the truth pressing against his chest. "Because it's a life full of mistakes." Zoe reached out, her hand brushing his. "Mistakes don't make you unworthy, Alexander. They make you real." For a moment, he forgot who he was, the billionaire, the broken man. He just saw her, and in that moment, something fragile and beautiful began to grow. But the world outside didn't stop watching. People began to whisper, the billionaire and the barista. Social media called it a scandal. Old business partners sent him warnings. Emily's friends called it a phase, but Alexander didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing approval. He was chasing peace. Yet, even peace has its price. One afternoon, as he sat across from Zoe, the past came calling, literally. A message from Emily. After 5 years of silence, she wanted to meet. Just for closure, she wrote. Alexander froze. Zoe noticed. Everything okay? He forced a smile. Yeah, just something from the past. Zoe nodded slowly, though her eyes said she understood more than he wanted to admit. The next evening, he met Emily at a quiet restaurant. She looked the same, poised, graceful, but older in her sadness. I heard about your relationship, she began. Alexander sighed. You didn't come here for gossip, Emily. No, she said. I came here to see if you're happy, because once upon a time I wished you would be. He looked at her, emotions swirling. I thought I'd be happy when I had everything. Turns out I was happiest when I had someone who believed in me. Emily smiled faintly. And do you have that again? He thought of Zoe, her laughter, her courage, her warmth. Yes, he whispered. I do. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. Then maybe we were meant to break so you could learn how to love for real. That night, Alexander drove to Zoe's apartment in the rain. He didn't bring flowers or gifts, just the truth. When she opened the door, he stood there, drenched but smiling. I met Emily, he said, and I realized something. I don't want to spend another day without telling you what you mean to me. Zoe's eyes softened. And what do I mean to you, Alexander? He stepped closer. You're the only person who ever made me feel human again. You're my redemption, Zoe. She took his hand, tears shining in her eyes. Then promise me one thing. Don't love me because I healed you. Love me because you finally learned how to love. And he did. As the rain poured outside, Alexander kissed her. Not like a billionaire. Not like a man chasing perfection, but like a soul finally coming home. The morning after the rain smelled like new beginnings. But sometimes, new beginnings are heavier than the endings that came before. Alexander woke to the soft hum of sunlight slipping through Zoe's thin curtains. The world outside was waking up. The chatter of neighbors, the sound of buses, the laughter of kids running late for school. He wasn't used to this kind of morning. No maids, no marble floors, no quiet luxury, just life. Zoe stirred beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked peaceful, the kind of peace he'd been chasing for years, but never found in boardrooms or private jets. For a while he watched her breathe, wondering how something so simple could feel so sacred. Good morning, she murmured, her voice still heavy with sleep. Morning, he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You know, I could get used to this. Zoe smiled without opening her eyes. Then do. And for the first time in years, he actually believed he could. But the world had a different plan. By noon, his phone was full of notifications, articles, headlines, social media noise. Billionaire Alexander Cole spotted with cafe worker. From mansions to mocha, has Alexander lost his mind? Ex-wife Emily Hart finally speaks, I wish him peace. He scrolled through them in silence. The internet was cruel, twisting something pure into something scandalous. The comments hurt, not because of what they said about him, but because of what they said about her. Zoe noticed the change in his face the moment she entered the kitchen. Bad news? She asked quietly. He set the phone down. They're talking about us, about you. Zoe walked over, took his hand, and said calmly, Let them. Zoe, you don't understand. These people can ruin reputations overnight. She smiled softly. They can only ruin the ones who live for reputation. I live for truth. Her strength humbled him. He had spent a lifetime trying to control how people saw him. Zoe, on the other hand, was unshakable. She didn't need the world's approval. She had her own. Days turned into weeks. Alexander stopped attending corporate galas. He let others handle his companies. He spent his mornings at the cafe with Zoe, serving coffee, sweeping floors, laughing with strangers who didn't know or care who he was. For the first time, his days had rhythm, meaning, humanity. One afternoon, a group of teenagers came into the cafe, loud, full of life. Zoe knew them all. Hey, Marcus, you still writing those poems? She called out. The boy grinned shyly. Trying to. Alexander watched as Zoe knelt down beside the kids, listening to them, encouraging them to dream bigger. She didn't preach. She inspired by being real. Later, when they closed up shop, he asked, "You know all their stories?" Zoe nodded. "Most of them. They come from broken homes, hard lives. I try to give them something steady, even if it's just a smile or a cup of cocoa." He looked at her, overwhelmed. "You're doing more for people than I ever did with all my billions." She turned to him with warmth in her eyes. "You can start now." That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in his mind. "You can start now." He went to his desk and opened his laptop. For years, he had run foundations, charities, donations, all for tax breaks and good press. But now he wanted something real, something born from Zoe's light, not his guilt. By dawn, he had a plan, a new initiative to fund education, mentorship, and community centers for kids from struggling neighborhoods. He called it Project Horizon. When he told Zoe, she just smiled. "You're learning," she said softly. "I'm learning from the best. But peace is never permanent in a world built on judgment." A week later, Zoe came home to find Alexander sitting on her couch, his face pale. On the table lay a newspaper, and her photo on the front page. Zoe Bennett, the woman who stole a billionaire's heart and his mind. The article twisted everything, her background, her job, even her motives. It painted her as an opportunist, a manipulator, someone who used love for gain. The cruelest part? They dug into her past, her father's arrest, her struggles, her years working double shifts. Zoe's hands trembled as she read. "They make it sound like I'm dirty," she whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'll call my lawyers. I'll make them—" "No," Zoe interrupted, her voice breaking. "This is your world, Alexander. This is what people like me face when we dare to exist in it." He reached for her. "Zoe, please!" She stepped back, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I love you, Alex, but love shouldn't cost a person their dignity." He froze. "You're not leaving me, are you?" Zoe looked at him with heartbreak in her eyes. "I need time. Not because I doubt you, but because I need to remember who I am before the world tries to tell me who I'm not." The next few days were unbearable. The penthouse felt empty again. The silence was louder than any storm. He tried to work, but every word he read blurred with memories of her laughter. He saw her everywhere, in the steam of his coffee, in the color of the sunset, in the silence between heartbeats. For the first time, Alexander realized he couldn't fix this with money. He had to earn it back, not her love, but her faith. He drove to the youth center. Zoe used to volunteer. Hatton spent the next few weeks working quietly, fixing walls, painting classrooms, helping kids with their homework. He didn't tell anyone who he was. He didn't need to. One afternoon, Marcus, the boy from the cafe, asked, "Mister, why are you doing all this?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Because someone once showed me that love means showing up, even when no one's watching." Months passed. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals. Life moved on. But Alexander didn't. He kept building Project Horizon, funding centers in Zoe's neighborhood under her name. He never called her, never showed up at her apartment. He wanted her to come back when her heart told her to, not because he asked. Then, one late evening, as he was locking up the youth center, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You missed a spot on that wall," Zoe said softly. He turned, breath catching in his chest. She was standing there, the same calm fire in her eyes, the same grace that undid him. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a tired smile. "You came," he whispered. "I never really left," she said. "I just needed to see if the man I fell in love with was still finding himself." He stepped closer. "And did he?" Zoe nodded. "He did. I saw what you've built, what you're doing for these kids. You didn't just find redemption, Alexander. You became it." He took her hand, his voice trembling. "Zoe, I don't want to live in a world where you're not beside me." She smiled through tears. "Then stop building worlds that separate us." That night, they sat on the steps of the center, side by side, watching the city lights flicker. No fame, no luxury, just two hearts that had learned how to break and rebuild. Zoe leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, I used to think love was about finding the perfect person." He looked down at her. "And now, Now I think it's about finding someone willing to grow. Alexander wrapped his arm around her and whispered, "Then I guess we finally found it." The night wrapped around them, soft, forgiving, endless. The following months were a strange kind of peace, the kind that trembles under its own fragility. Alexander and Zoe tried to build a new rhythm, simple but strong. They spent mornings at the youth center and evenings walking by the riverside, where the city's reflection shimmered like a dream they both feared to lose. He had given up the corporate noise. She had returned to her cafe, not because she had to, but because she wanted to keep something of her own. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Yet even the gentlest love has to face the world's harshest questions. The return of old shadows. One autumn evening, Alexander attended a charity gala, reluctantly. It was one of those old obligations he couldn't escape. His board demanded his presence. Investors wanted reassurance that the old Alexander was still reliable. Zoe agreed to join him. She wore a long emerald dress, her hair soft around her shoulders, her confidence glowing like quiet fire. When they entered the ballroom together, the room froze for a second. Conversation stumbled, glasses paused mid-air. Every head turned. The billionaire everyone once admired now walked hand in hand with the woman tabloids had mocked. A man in a tuxedo leaned toward his wife, whispering not quietly enough, "That's her? The cafe girl?" His wife's eyes narrowed. "I didn't know billionaires came with community service now." Zoe heard it. She always did. But she squeezed Alexander's hand gently, her silent way of saying, "Don't react." Alexander smiled, but inside something burned. Every fake smile, every whispered insult. They weren't just attacking him, they were tearing at her. During dinner, one of his old business partners, Richard, raised a glass. "To Alexander Cole," he announced loudly. "Proof that even billionaires can fall. In love or whatever this is." Laughter followed. Bitter, polished, hollow laughter. Zoe stood quietly. She looked around at the people dressed in diamonds but empty inside. Then she spoke softly but clearly. "Funny thing about falling," she said. "Sometimes you fall to your knees and sometimes you fall into grace. Depends on what you're chasing." The room went silent. Alexander turned to her, admiration, pride, and awe flooding through him. She didn't need to be rich to have power. She was power. That night when they got home, he held her tightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should never have brought you there." Zoe looked up at him. "Don't apologize for their ignorance. You didn't cause it. You just stopped living by it." Weeks later, Alexander received a message he'd been dreading, a call from his mother. They hadn't spoken in years. She lived in an old estate outside Boston, surrounded by traditions as heavy as the marble statues in her garden. She wanted to meet and bring her, she said. Zoe hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "If we're building a life together, my family needs to know you, the real you." "Bring her," she said. Zoe hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "If we're building a life together, my family needs to know you, the real you." Not the version they imagine. The drive was long, quiet. Zoe stared out the window as the city disappeared into rolling hills. "What if they don't like me?" she asked softly. He reached for her hand. "Then they'll learn what loss feels like." When they arrived, Alexander's mother greeted them on the grand porch, elegant, sharp-eyed, her tone coated with polite frost. "Alexander," she said, "it's been too long." Then her gaze moved to Zoe. "So this is the woman the world can't stop talking about." Zoe extended her hand with a warm smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Cole." The older woman paused just a second too long before taking it. "Likewise." Dinner was elegant and unbearable. The table was long enough to seat 20, yet somehow felt too small for the tension between them. His mother asked about Zoe's background, her ambitions, her intentions. Every word was a test. Zoe answered with grace. "I don't want Alexander's money," she said calmly. "I just want to see him happy, and for him to be proud of who he is, not what he owns." His mother smiled tightly. "That's noble. Though in our world, love can be a very expensive experiment." Alexander set his fork down. "Mother!" Zoe gently touched his arm. "It's okay." But later, As they left the mansion, he saw the quiet pain in her eyes. In the car, she said softly, "She doesn't see me. She doesn't want to," he replied bitterly. "But she will." Zoe looked out the window at the moonlit road. "I don't need her to." "Alex, I just need you to remember that love isn't a rebellion. It's a choice, and you have to keep choosing it even when the world doesn't." The breaking point. Winter came early that year. The cafe struggled. New rent hikes, fewer customers, endless bills. Zoe refused to let Alexander pay. "I need to fight my own battles," she said. He didn't argue. But he started showing up earlier, helping clean, serving coffee, even baking muffins at 5 a.m. The locals began to warm to him, not as Alexander Cole, but as Zoe's guy who can't make cappuccino foam right. One night, Zoe came home late, exhausted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dragging you into a smaller life," she said quietly. He smiled. "Smaller? Zoe, this is the first time my life has ever fit me. But even love can bend under pressure." An old colleague came to visit him the next day, Richard again. "Alex," he said coldly, "you've changed. You're throwing away everything you built. Investors are pulling out. Your empire's slipping." Alexander stared out the window. "Maybe it's time it did." Richard leaned forward. "Because of her? Don't be foolish. This woman doesn't belong in our world. She'll leave you once she's had enough." Alexander's voice was calm but deadly. "Zoe isn't the one leaving. You are." He turned his back on the man, and on the life he once worshipped. When love becomes faith. Weeks later, Zoe fell sick. Stress, exhaustion, burnout. She refused to go to the hospital until Alexander insisted. At her bedside, he sat for hours holding her hand, watching her sleep. The machines beeped softly like fragile heartbeats. He realized then that love wasn't fireworks. It was quiet persistence. It was showing up even when life stopped applauding. When Zoe finally opened her eyes, she whispered, "You're still here." He smiled through tired eyes. "I'm never leaving again." She squeezed his hand. "Then promise me something." "Anything. Promise that if I ever forget who I am again, you'll remind me that I was never someone's charity case, that I was your equal." He leaned down, kissed her forehead. "You're not my equal, Zoe. You're my compass." By spring, Zoe recovered, stronger, gentler, wiser. They reopened the cafe together, renamed it Second Chance. On the wall, they painted a quote. "Love doesn't make life perfect. It makes it possible." Project Horizon grew too, now spreading across 5 cities. Every new youth center carried Zoe's influence. Warm colors, bookshelves filled with hope, laughter that replaced silence. One day, during a press interview, a reporter asked Alexander, "Do you ever regret giving up the empire you built?" He smiled. "No, I just changed its foundation. It's not built on power anymore, it's built on love." The photo from that day went viral. Alexander standing beside Zoe, their hands clasped, eyes shining not with wealth but peace. Months later at sunset, Alexander brought Zoe to the same cafe where they had met years ago. The tables were empty, the lights soft, the smell of cinnamon still in the air. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" he asked. She smiled. "You looked like you needed something strong." He took her hand, heart pounding. "You were right. I needed something strong enough to make me human again." Then he dropped to one knee. Zoe froze, tears already in her eyes. "Alex." He opened a small velvet box, but there wasn't a diamond inside. Instead, there was a simple silver band engraved with the words, "To begin again." "Zoe Bennett," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't need a perfect life. I just need one where I wake up beside you, in chaos, in peace, in every sunrise that reminds me who I am. Will you marry me?" Zoe covered her mouth, laughing through tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He stood, pulling her into his arms as the cafe lights flickered like stars. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars, people, stories. But in that tiny corner of the city, 2 souls finally found their forever. He ran to her, pulling her into his arms, trembling. "You're safe. You're safe." But behind her, their dream burned. The place that had healed them both was gone. The next morning, the media descended like vultures. Arson suspected in Billionaire's cafe fire. Jealous competitor? Hate crime? Investigation continues. Alexander didn't care about headlines this time. He cared about the hollow look in Zoe's eyes. She sat on the curb staring at the ashes. It wasn't just a cafe, Alex. It was our proof. Proof that something good could grow out of pain. He crouched beside her. We'll rebuild. Bigger. Brighter. She turned to him, her voice trembling. What if it happens again? What if the world just keeps trying to destroy what we build? He reached for her hands covered in soot and tears. Then we build... Anyway, the investigation revealed something chilling. The fire wasn't accidental. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through the back window. The culprit was caught days later. A man who had once worked for Alexander's company, fired years ago during the corporate cuts that made Alexander rich. He blamed me for his ruin, Alexander said bitterly when he heard the news. Said I deserved to lose everything. Zoe looked at him, her heart breaking for him. He didn't destroy you, Alex. He just reminded you why you changed. But the attack reopened old wounds. The public sympathy was mixed. Some praised their resilience. Others whispered that Alexander's past sins had finally caught up with him. And in those whispers, Emily reappeared. It was late one evening when she called. Emily, his ex-wife. Her voice was softer than he remembered. Alex, I saw the news. I'm sorry. He hesitated. Thank you, Emily. I wanted to say I'm proud of you, she said. You became the man I always hoped you'd be. He smiled faintly. It took me too long. Maybe, she said. But you got there. After a pause, she added, Tell Zoe she's stronger than most people I've ever known. Alexander froze, surprised. You know her? I've been watching from afar, Emily admitted. She did what I couldn't. She reached the part of you that money could never touch. When he hung up, he sat in silence. For the first time, the past and present didn't feel like enemies. They felt like chapters of the same story. Months passed. The cafe remained an empty lot. But from its ashes grew something even greater, a new community center. Zoe wanted it named the Ember House, because fire may destroy, but embers rebuild, she said. The opening day drew hundreds of people, children, families, volunteers, even former critics who now admired them. Alexander gave a speech, his voice full of emotion. Once upon a time, he began, I thought redemption was something you earned. But I learned it's something you live. Every day you choose to forgive, to rebuild, to love again, that's redemption. Zoe stood beside him, eyes glistening. When he finished, she whispered, Time moved differently for Alexander and Zoe. Where once their days were filled with headlines, speeches and noise, now they were wrapped in the gentle quiet of a life fully lived. It had been 15 years since the night they built the Ember House. The world around them had changed. Children who'd once played in those halls were now adults, running their own projects, healing their own broken corners of the world. But inside those walls, one thing never changed, their story. Every morning, Alexander still rose early, not to chase numbers or meetings, but to walk through the garden behind their home. Zoe always followed, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of coffee. They had moved into a modest villa overlooking the city, not lavish, like his old mansion, but peaceful, alive with sunlight and the soft sound of laughter from children playing nearby. Zoe often joked, You traded skyscrapers for sunflowers, Mr. Billionaire. And he would smile, eyes warm. Best trade I ever made. Their days were full. Mentoring youth, visiting shelters, hosting dinners for the less fortunate. The man who once built empires now built people. The woman who once feared the world's cruelty had become its quiet strength. But behind that peace, life had begun whispering a truth neither wanted to face. Time was catching up. It began one winter evening. Zoe had been tired lately, more than usual. A doctor's visit turned into tests, and tests turned into news that made Alexander's hands tremble. It's early-stage lymphoma, the doctor said gently. We caught it soon. With treatment, there's hope. Hope, that fragile word that once saved his life, now felt like glass. Zoe tried to smile through it. Don't look at me like that, Alex. You've faced worse storms. He took her hand. Not this one. But Zoe refused to let sickness steal her light. She went through treatment with grace, humor and courage, greeting every nurse, cheering up every patient, as if she were the one visiting them. Even when her hair began to fall, she would tease him. Now you have the prettier curls, old man. And he'd laugh, though his eyes shimmered with tears he never let her see. During those months, Zoe began writing letters, small folded notes, sealed in envelopes marked with names. Something for later, she'd say when he asked. Alexander didn't press her. He knew she was preparing the world for something she wasn't ready to say aloud. One night, as rain tapped against their window, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "Alex, do you ever wonder what people will remember about us?" He smiled faintly. "That we loved louder than the world doubted us." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Then I can rest easy." Zoe's health worsened quietly. No dramatic hospital scenes. No final words under a spotlight. She faded the way she lived, gracefully, without complaint. One spring morning, Alexander woke to find her watching the sunrise from the porch. Wrapped in a blanket, he sat beside her, wordless. After a long silence, she whispered, "You know, when I met you, I didn't believe in happy endings." He turned to her, his voice breaking. "You gave me one." She smiled softly. "No, we gave each other one." Then she leaned her head on his shoulder, and as the first light of dawn brushed her face, she simply rested and never woke again. The funeral was simple. No reporters, no lavish flowers, just people whose lives she'd touched, children she'd fed, women she'd mentored, men who'd found hope again through her kindness. Alexander stood there in silence, holding a single sunflower, her favorite. When the last word was spoken, he whispered, "You didn't just save me, Zoe, you taught me how to live." And then he let the flower fall onto her casket, carried away by the soft spring wind. After that, he spent years fulfilling her letters, every single one. One was for the children of the Ember House. "Keep building. The world needs your fire." One was for her friend at the cafe. "Thank you for giving me my first job and my first family." And one, the last one, was for Alexander. He found it on their anniversary inside her old piano bench. It read, 10 years later, the Ember Foundation had grown into one of the world's largest community aid programs. Thousands of volunteers worked under Zoe's name, helping orphans, rebuilding towns, educating girls. At the center of the main hall stood a statue, two hands holding a heart made of glass. At its base, the inscription read, "Love fixes broken things." Alexander, now in his 80s, still visited every week. He'd sit in the garden outside the building, surrounded by laughter, sunlight, and the scent of blooming sunflowers. One young woman approached him one day, a volunteer. "Mr. Cole," she said shyly, "I just wanted to thank you. I came here lost. Now I'm studying to be a teacher because of Zoe's story." He smiled gently. Then she'd be proud. She always believed broken things could teach the world how to shine. The girl smiled back. "She must have loved you very much." Alexander looked up at the sky, eyes glistening. "She still does. If you're reading this, I'm already home. Don't cry for me. I never left. I live in every smile you bring to someone else. You once promised me you'd never let the world make you cold again. Keep that promise, Alex. Keep loving, even when it hurts. That's where I'll be." He wept for hours that night. Not from sorrow, but gratitude. Because love like hers doesn't end. It becomes part of everything. That evening, he returned home. The same porch, the same view. He sat down with 2 cups of coffee, one beside the empty chair next to him. The sky was painted in gold and rose. He felt the wind brush against his face, soft, familiar, like a whisper. And for the first time in years, he closed his eyes and felt peace. The next morning, the housekeeper found him there, smiling. Eyes closed, hand resting on the second cup. Side by side, 2 coffee cups sat in the morning light, steam curling into the dawn. He had kept his promise. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Zoe was waiting, barefoot, laughing, reaching out her hand as the man who'd once been broken walked into the light beside her. Years later, children at the Ember House still tell their story. The billionaire and the girl who taught him how to love. It became legend, not because of money or fame, but because it reminded the world of one simple truth. Love, real love, doesn't end with goodbye. It begins when 2 souls decide to rebuild the world together, even when everything tries to tear them apart. And that was the legacy of Alexander and Zoe.